How's it going, YouTube? This is Skul, and today I have, I hope, a fun video for you guys about what my opinion is on whether the Nintendo Switch is an 8th generation video game console or a 9th generation video game console. And I'm sure some of you don't even know what I'm talking about when I say generations of video game consoles, so I'll give you a rough idea of what a generation is. A generation of video game consoles is where you can group a ton of consoles together and find similar properties among them. For example, the Nintendo Super NES and the Sega Genesis, or the Sega Mega Drive as it's known in other parts of the world, all had similar properties. They played 16-bit games, they were able to play primitive 3D graphics if they so chose, and it was marked by a huge competition between them during that time. You might recall the commercials where the Genesis does what Nintendo don't. You get the idea. Whereas the following generation would be marked by the Sega Saturn for Sega and the Nintendo 64. And just looking at the two, you could easily compare them and see that these new games were impossible to play on the old machines. But it would be a breeze for the old games to play on the new machines, theoretically, if they ever went that route. So, this is my Nintendo Switch. I am holding the entire console in my hand. This is the game console. This isn't the controller, this isn't a peripheral, this isn't an extra screen, this is the game console. Where does this fit in our knowledge of video game console generations? Well, believe it or not, we are actually in the 8th generation of video game consoles currently, as far as anyone's concerned. It's still up for debate whether this is the 9th generation console or it lumps into the 8th generation. But as far as all the other consoles out there that are commercially available, it's the 8th generation. What does the 8th generation look like compared to previous generations? Well, the first generation was mostly Pong consoles. Consoles that were only able to play one game, had primitive graphics, very rarely any sound effects. Second generation was stuff like the Atari 2600. Better graphics, able to use sound, and introduced interchangeable cartridges and controllers. Third generation, 8-bit games. Fourth generation, 16-bit games. Fifth generation, 3D graphics. Sixth generation, more going on screen at once. The introduction of internet gameplay. And the seventh generation was the introduction of making a console a home entertainment system and HD technology. The 8th generation is kind of hard to define compared with the 7th. We still use our game consoles as home entertainment systems. We still have internet connectivity, and we still have HD graphics. About the one thing that we can say for sure is that all of these consoles that we have in this generation are sequels to the previous consoles. The PlayStation 4 is just one step above the PlayStation 3. The Xbox One is one step above the Xbox 360, and the Wii U is a step above the Wii. Sometimes. So, it's hard to define what separates the 8th generation from the 7th generation. And thus, it's going to be hard to separate the 9th generation from the 8th generation. Frankly, I consider this an 8th generation console. But I've heard arguments that it's the 9th generation console, or the very first one from the 9th generation, but you know, who knows for sure? At least right now. I'm sure in 10 years we're going to look back at this and definitively say one way or the other what this was. I hope. Sometimes it's hard to tell because you got things like the Sega 32X, which required the Sega Genesis to run, but it was capable of putting out graphics and all sorts of stuff from the later generation. But it required hardware from the previous generation. The biggest argument I've heard against the Nintendo Switch being an 8th generation console is Nintendo already put out an 8th gen console, the Wii U. That's not to say that it is a 9th gen console just because it's impossible for a company to release two consoles in the same generation. Neo Geo came out with the Neo Geo AES and the Neo Geo CD, both in the 4th generation. At the same time, Atari, probably the most well-known video game company besides Nintendo, put out the 2600 and the 5200 both in the 2nd generation. Although arguments could be made the 5200 is part of the 3rd generation, most people consider it part of the 2nd. When it comes down to it, what really separates the Switch from the Wii U? And how does this compare to the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4? And if this is the 9th generation of video game consoles, what does that mean that we should look for in the future? Before the Switch came out, I heard most people saying that the 9th gen will probably focus more on VR technology, or stuff like that. Anything but portable game consoles. When the Switch came out, all of a sudden people were like, well, now Microsoft and Sony have to put out a portable, something to this extent for their 9th gen consoles just to catch up. As far as I know, Sony and Microsoft have absolutely no intentions of that. Their focuses right now are to build upon their current consoles and make them a little more better without upgrading to a full console in the next generation. As you know, probably, the PlayStation 4 Pro just came out, and it's basically a PlayStation 4, but it can play 4K technology, it can render some games a little better at a more consistent frame rate. The Xbox One Scorpio, as it's known for now, I'm sure it'll have another name in the future, it will do the same thing. It'll be able to run at 4K, it'll be able to play 4K Blu-rays, basically just upgrading the graphics without upgrading the console itself. The Switch compared with the Wii U, this is a completely different console. It is. This does a lot of stuff the Wii U shouldn't do, that it can't do, and most people that I know, and I agree, believe that this should have been what the Wii U was. You can make the argument that without the Wii U, we wouldn't have the Switch as we know it, but Nintendo really should have gone from the Wii to the Switch. They did the Wii U instead, and as most people know, that was a pretty bad commercial failure. Only sold 13 million copies in the world for the hardware. This might pass that within the first year of sales. Think about that. How does this compare with the Wii U, and how does this compare with the other consoles? Well, comparing it with the Wii U, this is a single console, not a console and a gamepad like the Wii U had. It just threw people off to no end whether the gamepad was the console or not. May as well have been this. So, this is able to play games, better games, bigger games, and the most impressive thing of all is that it's able to do all of that using a cartridge this size. This is the size of the top of my thumb. Just barely bigger than my thumbnail. Think about that. And it's able to play games using a cartridge that size. That's just unbelievable technology. I'm sure if Nintendo wanted to make a dedicated home console that wasn't a hybrid, they'd be able to make it up to specs that far surpass the PlayStation and Microsoft if they had wanted. They decided just to make this portable because that's their newest gimmick. So compared with the Wii U, it's able to play better games. It's able to play games at a better frame rate. The biggest comparison is one of the only games released on both the Wii U and the Switch, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. There's been plenty of comparison videos comparing the two, and they're basically the exact same game, but the Switch has some better draw distances, it has some enhanced graphics in places, especially the title screen. It's just able to do more than the Wii U could, and it's able to do it on a smaller hardware space than the Wii U has. So there is that. So, if it's a step up from the Wii U, does that mean that it is a step up from the previous generation? I have to say I'm not an expert on the specs of this thing. I don't know what they are. I don't know what the specs are for the Xbox or the PlayStation. All I know is that right now, the PlayStation has the best specs out of all of them, especially the PS4 Pro. So if I get any of this wrong, I'm sorry, but this is how I understand it. This thing is about on par with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. Game consoles from the 7th generation. So this is capable of playing, as far as I know, most, if not all, of those games, and maybe some games that have come out on the Xbox One and PS4. Of course, the biggest one that I can think of right now is Yooka-Laylee. That already has been released on the Xbox One and PS4. I have it on the Xbox One. It was developed for the Wii U, was dropped, and it'll get a Switch release sometime. So it is capable of playing, at the very least, some games in the current generation, and at best, most games in the current generation. Again, I don't know what the specs are. I know that there are some games that it'll just be impossible for this to play, but I also know that this is capable of playing games like Overwatch or Battlefield, maybe. So we're up to the fact that it is a that is comparable to the current generation of video game consoles. Is it a next generation video game console? Well, the argument I hear, like I said, is that this would be the second Nintendo console in the current generation. I've heard arguments that the Wii U isn't even Generation 8. It's more like Generation 7.5. It was barely capable of playing any other games in any third-party libraries that have come out in the past 5 years. Almost all the games on it are first-party, made specifically for the console. It's sort of a weird thing. That it's kind of like the Atari Jaguar, in that you have to build the games for that console. You can't port the games to the console. Not like you can port it to this. I've heard plenty of tweets and interviews with third-party developers saying that their dev kits for the Switch are so nice and so clean that they want to make games for this. Compared with the Wii U, where it would have taken an arm and a leg to do it. That's why I think this is a current generation console. I think this is an 8th generation console, just with the gimmick of being able to take it to Starbucks. I think that if it's comparable to the 2 other competitors out there, and not superior to them, it has to be current generation. You could make the argument it's not even up to current generation standards. I would make the argument this is, the Wii U isn't. The Wii U, in my opinion, shouldn't even count as Gen 8. Shouldn't count as Gen 7. It should be like the middleman, 7.5, like I said. All I know is that the Switch, if we're talking about generations in the sense of can it play superior games to what everyone else has, easily the answer is no. This has to be comparable to current gen technology, which makes it, in my opinion, a current gen console. That being said, I'm holding the whole console in my hand. I've been waving it around this whole time, talking to you, explaining to you my thoughts on it. If the future of generations of video game consoles are that they are hybrids, then the argument could be made that this is the first 9th generation console. I would dispute that argument, but it is a valid argument. So that pretty much sums up my thoughts on this, but I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think the Nintendo Switch is an 8th generation or 9th generation console? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And yeah, I hope that you all enjoyed. I hope you consider subscribing for future episodes. And that does it. Here's the end card. Hi everyone, this is Skul. If you liked the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. If you're already subscribed, hit that little bell so you get notifications whenever I upload a new video. That does it for now. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.